capitalism has this fetishization that the origin is this pure center of genesis, of genius, and that it can't be repeated. In a way, to repeat it is to kind of go against this idea of scarcity that it so believes in, right? And I look at the sophomore books, Liam Lee's Say in Which I Love You, Natalie Diaz's Post-Colonial Love Poem, Terence Hayes' Hip Logic. And I would add to that Scorched Earth. And I wonder if you think, I want to ask you how you think through that, because I think, why would I think that? Why do I say that? Because I think there's something about how writers of color often are confronted with hegemonic literary production, in which we're told, you should be grateful, you have a seat, you've made it here, you've shown your work. And there's a kind of expectation that that should placate us, and there should be enough. But what I've seen evidentiarily through the sophomore books I've mentioned and more, is that there's a kind of, the work actually begins after finding a place and finding a community. And I feel like the sophomore is actually, the throw has been cleared, the necessary performance of legibility that so many of us have to do, gesturing at the canon, winking at the reviewers and the publisher and saying, yes, I did my homework, yes, I was a good student. And I feel like going off, if you will, or being extra, being too much, is where the second book really hunkers down. Can you talk about how, because I feel it on the page, and when I'm reading it, I just want to like walk around the room and clap, right? Because I'm like, she's not only here, she's been here, and she's digging in. And the work is just beginning. So thank you for that.
Oh, wow. I know. What a gorgeous, gorgeous question. And thank you for adding to that list of books that I adore. It's so interesting. You get my mind going in several different directions. One thing that actually Gabrielle Gavin-Cressy told me, I was during my first book, and I was feeling exactly what you were feeling, and I was experiencing a lot of harm, kind of that was invisible, often from the white world. And Gabrielle Gavin-Cressy said something to me that changed my life, and they said, sometimes as an emerging writer, you feel like you have to be so grateful for everything that you're not allowed to ask for anything. And when they said that, I was like, oh damn, like that has been me. Because I was good teacher, yes, in any ways, it's almost like we wear the mask, right? The Paul Laurence Dunbar, that grins and lies, right? And we're performing this respectability politics, right, to prove ourselves. It's interesting, thinking about Phyllis Wheatley, that I'm thinking I'm no different, not having these 18 notable white women from Boston, but there's a way in which those 18 notable white women from Boston have changed into different avenues, right? And then I also went to a panel at AWP a couple years ago in Portland, and I went to a panel with Melissa Febos, and she said something incredible about repetition. And she said, capitalism teaches you that you're not allowed to repeat yourself. The marketplace doesn't want you to repeat yourself. But she was like, that's bullshit. You absolutely can return to the subject matter as many times as you want to. And that gave me a lot of sense of power. But you're right, I think the first book for a lot of poets, or at least it was for me, it's really tied to your MFA experience, that tied to please professor mode. My professors were that old school approach, professors, Bible, professors, canon, professor, whatever professor, and I was responding that way of like, yes sir, I was listening to them, and it took me a while to silence those voices and to learn to trust myself again in that process, to have a fallow period, to let the soil remineralize. What does it mean to hear my own voice and to trust it again? After I've been playing this game, the game of capitalism, the game of, it's interesting if anyone's seen Bamboozled by Spike Lee, kind of that minstrel show, right? Where you think you're not in the minstrel show, and all of a sudden, the mask has now been fused to your face, and you don't know who you are and who is the mask and what is in between, right? So for this book, I was just like, F all that, I'm gonna do whatever the heck I wanna do. But I do say that with a bit of privilege, like, because it's this weird thing of like, you play the game a little bit to get to the place where you can break it. I mean, I don't know if you feel that way, but I think it's an interesting place where I was just like, well, screw it, I'm gonna write this book for me. You know?
Well, and you realize that a lot of it, the current of everything is still capitalism regardless, because there's this, when you're a struggling younger poet writing your first book, all the doors are closed, and the answer on the other side of the gate is, this is a meritocracy. Come back when we decide you're good enough. And then when you get published, and maybe you have some success, all of a sudden when you're on the inside of that gate, they're like, give us more. We'll publish anything. Grocery lists, diaries. You want 3-book contract, 4-book contract? We'll publish Phantoms. And so you realize there's a double standard, and how many folks, when we arrive here, you talk about ancestries, and anytime you see 2 writers of color coming through these traditions, you must also realize there are thousands of who never made it, and how consequential that double standard is. And it's almost like when it's almost too late, and you wish you knew it prior. But I think there's the power of this book also, beyond its restlessness in form, its curiosity, is that it centers the process as a mode of curiosity and delight. And I think in relation to how often poets in our vein are asked to perform an authentic version of our communities, thereby reducing us to something legible, portable, commodifiable. This book is all about process. It's turning the process itself into the project. It's almost like it's going backstage. When I saw the word AWP, I was like, you're going where no one has gone before. Putting AWP in a lyric poem. But I think for me, I read this book and I thought, gosh, 100 years from now, if whoever's even here, if the aliens want to know what it was like to be a poet in the 21st century, in the early 21st century, this book gets them covered. Because it's the vexation of thinking through these terms, of capital, authenticity, betrayals, archival pressure, and still honoring the traditions, both present and past, that you came from. And can I just ask you a little bit about your relationship to the liminality of thought? Because the poem is often historically presented as a product, a public-facing, something full of finesse and completion. I mean, the sonnet's volta, right? It turns towards a final beat. And I think what you're doing is you're kind of upending that, but you're not I don't think it would be a disrespect to even say you're in opposition to that. I think you're doing something much more interesting, is that you're just turning your back on it and going towards an elsewhere. Do you feel that way?
Each question is like a beautiful essay that I'm just I live in the liminal, right? My blood is liminal. I am liminal in so many different ways. And so I feel like for me, liminality, I'm thinking of, the borderlands, right? Like, I think that sense of not being easy to define is really important to me. And it took me a long time to find that fluidity. I think in my graduate school, I had so much fear and so much anxiety being found out. Going back to your earlier point about having to prove yourself in capitalism, and I'm headed up to where I am now. I think when you grow up in a feast or famine kind of way, when you grow up poor, there is no saving or thinking about the future. There's only the urgent need. One of my favorite poems is from Terrence Hayes, where Lighthead's Guide to the Galaxy, where he says, "I'd rather have what my daddy calls scrimp. He says the street, and just means the street out of sight. Not what you see, but what you perceive. That's poetry. Not the noise, but its rhythms. An arrangement of derangements. I'll eat you to live. That's poetry." For me, that it's if my mom ordered pizza, that pizza was supposed to last for the whole week, right? It's supposed to be consumed. And I'll never forget when I was in graduate school, I wrote a poem about Rihanna, and my mentor at the time said, you shouldn't put pop culture in your poems. She's like, you should never have a timestamp in your poems. And I was like, why? And she's like, well, don't you care about mastery? Don't you care about legacy? And I was like, no, I don't. And that's when I realized I was actively working against it. That's when I realized I was actively turning my back against it. Not only am I not working for mastery, I could not care less. I couldn't care less, right?
And why is forever equated to mastery? That's an arbitrary concept in itself, right? We all know that things that last forever actually destroys our planet. And so it's an interesting thing that the idea of living, the obsession of immortality is equated to mastery. When of course we all know that some of the most ephemeral things, sunsets, butterflies living in their briefest form, are so innately beautiful. The lyric poem itself is powerful in its, shortness, in its briefness, its portability. And I think that's what I really love about your work, because you question the validity of the questions. Your poems are kind of, they put their hands up and they say, that's not a given truth. In fact, truth is historically variable and only true according to who's in power. And what I really love about your bringing in Miss Wheatley's work is that there is a kind of phantom in her second book, right? It's not arrived. And it's important for me also, as a New England writer, to think of Wheatley writing in Massachusetts, but also Jupiter Hammond, also enslaved poet, writing in Connecticut. And I've always felt like the American tradition, for me, so much of what our work is understanding the canon and also realizing the canon is a fabrication. It's actually just one set out of many. And I've always felt that all writers working in innovative, oppositional works in relation to power are working in the long shadow of Black thought, myself included. And I think one of the struggles of contemporary publishing is that we're told that we're all in discrete lineages, one flavor out of the rainbow, etc. But if you go back and look at Hammond, Wheatley, the beginning of working against power owes itself to Black thought. And whether you're an Asian American writer or a Puerto Rican writer or what have you, working in this tradition, you might not have read a single Black poet, which was be to your own loss and demise, you're still in that tradition because those writers have made your work legible. They've made it so that you're understood in a way. And I'm interested in how you think about lineages and traditions, and where do you see the work heading towards? It's like the ancestors, have they imagined the formal maneuvers that we are doing? I'm always curious about that, right? Because Wheatley had to write in a strict form in which she could be sort of legible and clear. And I think the ground of that is that we can move towards different ideas of legibility to each other.
Blowing my mind, I have like 17 different thoughts. So fascinating what you're saying, because especially with Wheatley, she's playing like 7-layer chess. Because she's, number one, she can't be like, hey y'all, slavery sucks. She has to use the form of the sonnet, right? Use the rhetorical argument of the sonnet. Hey, remember Christians, if you believe in the Bible, then we're gonna be on that train too, right? She's trying to use their rhetoric against them, right? And it's so interesting because it's in my first book, I forget the author, but there's an incredible researcher who studied Phyllis Wheatley's letters, and there's one particular correspondence between her and Tiana, and it's the only example of we have of Phyllis Wheatley writing to another enslaved Black poet, another enslaved Black person. She wasn't a poet at the time. But it's interesting because one thing that this writer talks about is Phyllis Wheatley could not write to her directly. It was always in the care of, in the hands of. It had to be handed to a white person's hands to be transmitted, right? She could never write to her freely. So even in her own communication to another Black writer, it had to be under the mechanism of white hands. And I thought about that so often, like, and it's interesting because if you actually read her letter, she was a hustler. When she's reaching out to Tanner, this is my paraphrase and my exact, she's like, girl, do you have, 5 on it for my book that's about to come out? She's trying to get a pre-order from her, because she's trying to set up a life for herself. It's, again, back to survival, I need you to live, that's poetry. And so, thinking about now, I can touch and talk to another Black writer or BIPOC writer in my work, and I do not take that for granted. And that sense of intimacy is extremely important to me. I think in some sense that, I get complicated about questions about audience, but if there is any audience, that is my audience that I'm trying to touch, right? That which she could not touch in her world. I'm also thinking about Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, because with this book, my first book had a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, and I was like, it cannot just be about survival. I want to thrive, right? And I was really interested in thinking about, well, if I can't find joy through the critical fabulation, can I speculate about joy? Can I use the subjective mode to have the possibility of joy? So maybe I question joy, but I still want to shoehorn it if I can, even if it's wonky, even if it doesn't make sense, because on my first book tour, I would be so depressed when I got back to my hotel room. It's a very lonely time. You're like emptied out. And I was just like, dear God, and you're often performing in front of white audiences and going back to help what they want from you. When George Floyd happened, I literally had an editor from a press that was like, can we have some poems about Black pain? I intentionally sat on this book when I could have published it because I was working against number one, I was working against the capitalist instinct of momentum. I was working against, just because a certain dream publisher wanted my book. There was a dream publisher that wanted my book, and when I asked him to describe my book to me, he's like, oh, it's so fierce. It's so political. I was like, oh, you were not the editor for me. I don't care how many incredible books you put out in the world. I do not trust you to carry my book, to put it in your hands, talking about hands. I do not trust my work, again, to be put in your hands, because again, it's in a white person's hands to be put out to the world, just like Phil Sweetley, right?
I need to go lay down. But it brings me to, I was reading recently, my students and I have been talking about Sarah Ahmed, and she wrote this seminal book called Cultural Politics of Emotion, right after 9/11. And it was such a kind of prophetic work, because we're feeling all the repercussions of it now. And one of the points that she makes is she charges this, she interrogates this idea of America's promise of the capacity for the pursuit of happiness. And in a way, that declaration coming from the nation puts happiness in hostage. It's a kind of bargain, right? It says, like, believe in us, secure the nation, invest in this nation, and you shall be granted something that perhaps should already be inherent, particularly in the Christian ethos that the country so often believes, or sort of believes, that happiness should be granted simply by being alive, and that right to pursue it. And she says it much clearer than I can say, and I'll quote it. The nation, for example, is installed as the, quote-unquote, hope of the subject, insofar as it guarantees the pursuit of happiness as its originary goal. The happiness promised by the nation is what sustains investment in the nation in the absence of return. A happiness that is always deferred as the promise of reward for good citizenship. So, in this vein, quote-unquote justice becomes the promised return for investment in the nation, but one that must not be realized for the investment to be sustained forever. The nation, in other words, becomes the, quote, agent of justice, the one that can deliver justice through happiness, but this capacity is sustained only through its failure to be actualized in the present. And in that sense, if the nation that all of us pay taxes to, whose weapons bomb innocent civilians that we have no say in which we are the cultural producers of its legibility, and it fails to commit itself to justice. Is it possible for poetry to have an alternative mode of justice? And I'm not asking you to answer that, it's unfair. It's an unfair question to ask one poet, but how do you think through that?
When you're reading your quote, of course, I hung on the word deferred. And of course, Hughes.
Langston, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because the American dream or the pursuit of happiness has never been possible. I mean, it's a fallacy, right? It's propaganda. And I think for me, it's so interesting. A couple 4th of Julys ago, I teach at a program in Swanee, which is like deep in the South. And it was when Roe v. Wade was turned over, and they have a really huge 4th of July, like the old school kind of Norman Rockwell 4th of July. And it was really interesting because I was reckoning with this idea of like the pageantry of freedom, the theatrics of it. This kind of, this American fiction that never really existed, the buy-in. I'll never forget, there was a white woman and she was like, I just don't think I can do it this year. This is the first time I've ever not wanted to celebrate in the 4th of July. And I was like, what? The first time? Now? Oh, because your rights are threatened? Now you have an openness and awareness to the world. And so, yeah, I'm kind of reckoning, I think, with that idea that I think poets have, or I guess for me, I would say Black poets. Number one, for me, I've never looked to the canon to be reflected back to me, or this idea that I've had to always kind of build my own literary ancestry, build my own sense of freedom through Black poets who were oppressed. And that is where I have personally found my sense of happiness is, I feel like they have written that freedom back into me.
I tell my students I feel so lucky to arrive this late to the tradition. Because we get to have Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Maxine Hong Kingston, Lee Young Lee. We get them as we work. They didn't have themselves. They had to be themselves. Imagine that you're Toni Morrison writing without a Toni Morrison. How, I'm just like, I feel like I'm in a cheat code just because I came late. The archive is bigger. We can think more robustly. And speaking of the archive, wanted to ask you this. We're talking about Glissant's idea of opacity. And those, again, I tell it to my students, like, to me, the Black tradition of radical thinking is an American tradition, and you miss it at your own demise. And as an Asian American, immigrant, queer writer, whatever labels you want to put on me, there are no questions that I've asked in my own work that a Black writer has not already asked and answered before me on a global scale. Diaspora, immigration, everything. Right? Claude McKay, I was like, they got it covered. And I feel empowered to continue that. And so on one hand, Glissant's idea of opacity as a kind of self-preservation, not making yourself legible, not making yourself clear, moving towards a more difficult poetics, on one hand, highly important to me. And on another hand, Baldwin comes in, and I think he said this in the 70s after many of his friends were being killed. And it was a Black reporter, a Black student reporter asking him this question. He said, why don't you write in vernacular? Like Zora Neale Hurston, Hughes, etc. And Baldwin says something that stuck with me. And he says, I need to write in standard English because it is the English that is legible to the people who are trying to kill me. And I cannot afford to be misunderstood because I'm speaking from my life. And between those two poles, I think everything is possible. And every writer falls on those poles, but thank goodness we have those poles because they've been argued for so legitimately and robustly, right? And I'm just curious where you fall on those terms.
Oh man, I love thinking about Glissant in relation to Baldwin. I think it's interesting thinking about Glissant and this idea also of, again, what is legible and what is not legible. It's the original FUBU, for us, by us, right? And what I love about it, and specifically looking at Creole culture, of that there's a particular plantation where they weren't even allowed to talk to each other. And so they would use screams as a way to talk to each other. So imagine screaming being the language in which you communicate to the people that you love. Or dancing, right? So what I think is interesting, that even though Baldwin felt that he had to use, standard American English, the ways in which I think people in the diaspora have had to be creative, right? To use dance, to use music, to talk to each other. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I hadn't put this together, but even thinking about Phyllis Wheatley, to me, she's living so many different things in her text, that we as poets now can read her work and look at that subterranean consciousness that was actually speaking to us now, that couldn't be free to speak then, right? So she's using the master's tools, right? I've been thinking about this, that Audre Lorde, I say like you can't use the master's tools to the master's house, but I was like, I think Phyllis Wheatley did. And I don't want to argue with Lord, and Lord is Lord. But I'm like, I think Phyllis Wheatley did. Do you know what I mean? And so, going back to Terrence Hayes, he says a sonnet is a room you can scream into, going back to the scream sounds. And she's using the sonnet as a form. That might have been a whisper to them, but it's screaming to me now, right?
You can apply that to Douglas's work, right? Because he's using that oratory tradition that was so revered in New England to ultimately alter the course of the war.
I think it's an important question, because I struggled with that early on in writing, of like,
I'm like, I haven't, good, at the end of this book here. She's talking about